Thank you, Jonathan, for those very kind comments. The most interesting bit of information about my biography that makes me the most content, I stepped down from all executive duties a year ago. I'm now again just an ordinary lab scientist. I'm very, very happy. More contented than any other point in my life. So I'll talk about the elephant in the room. By the elephant in the room, I mean consciousness, of course. And what always motivated me from a young age was the fact that, as scientists, we try to explain everything there is. Physicists are looking for the theory of everything. Yet the central aspect of my life, and of all of our lives, consciousness. The only way I know anything exists, including myself. If I'm a physicist, I have to read off measurements, and I use vision to read off measurements, right? And Schrödinger and lots of other physicists have remarked upon this. But it always struck me as a scandal that the central aspect of my life was off limit. I was told early on, before I'd obtained the holy state of tenure, no, you got to wait. You got to wait. Francis Crick, you wait till you get your Nobel Prize or retire, and then you can think about consciousness. And this just struck me as inane. All right, so as a disclosure, I started a company a couple of years ago to build a device to test for the presence of consciousness in the clinic. All right, so I'll just give you to sort of define what I mean by consciousness. Two conscious experience. One is an extraordinary one, simply in the sense of it's out of the ordinary. These are both two experiences I had at the beginning of the pandemic 4 years ago. So this is what's called, you can read it, it's what's also known as a near-death experience. When there are very few, when the content of consciousness is reduced to almost nothing. I was there with eyes wide open, yet the only thing I experienced was this brightness of unbearable light, unbearable brightness, and a feeling of terror and ecstasy. All right, so there's no body, there's no self. This is also that taught me that self-consciousness is just an aspect of consciousness. So of course we as adults, we have the self, the autobiographical and the experiential self. And in fact, we always live on planet ego, right? Everything we do, we're always within the gravitational well of the self. Self is always, always, always there. Only in states of flow or in deep meditation or during other states can you sort of escape the gravitational pull of the self. Or in cases like this, near-death experience, can you escape this sense of self, which has advantages. And then this is sort of more an ordinary experiences, as you can do it just strolling across a campus, right? You walk, you feel, in this case, a run. You feel things, you hear things, there's memory, there's, what William James referred to as stream of consciousness. What characterizes both is that there is something it feels like to be, in the name of Thomas Nagel, to have this experience or that experience. And this is the central challenge of consciousness, because as we all know, this state is you can't tell from the outside what I'm experiencing. You could be with your partner, lifetime partner for years, your bodies could interpenetrate. You can look at his or her eyes, and fundamentally you do not know what they're experiencing. You can just indirect by talking to them, by seeing how they respond, infer what they experience, right? And that's why studying these phenomena is more difficult than studying black holes or electrons, viruses, because they have what we call, what's called as third-person properties. My brain and all of our brains have third-person properties, but they also have this unique first-person properties. It feels like something to be the owner of a brain. And that's the central puzzle that science has to seek to explain using, on the assumption that it's a natural phenomenon. It's not an extra supernatural phenomenon. It's a natural phenomena, which may or may not be compatible with physicalist, standard materialist, or physicalist thinking, and that's okay. All right, so as many people, most famously René Descartes, right, the most famous Western deduction in Western thought, cogito ergo sum, and the only thing I'm truly certain of is that I'm conscious, and I'm utterly certain about the content. Now, the content may be totally delusionary, but that there is content, that there is color. In fact, I don't know about atoms. I read books about atoms. I listen to people who tell me about atoms, but I don't actually know atoms. What I do know, directly know, is, sights and sounds and hearing and smelling and being in love and being afraid. Those are the only thing I have direct acquaintance with. And so any ontology, any way, if you want to know what truly exists, has to start from this observation. Everything else is inferred. It's a very reasonable inference that there's an outside world, but we have to always remember it's an inference. So for me, consciousness is just having experiences. There are different words: subjective, phenomenal, qualia. It feels like something. These are all just different words for it, and what people mean when they say I see, I hear, I think, wanting, fearing, being in pain, etc. It's a very diverse set of experiences. Now, you have to be on the watch. There are many theories of consciousness, but they actually do a sleight of hand. They don't explain consciousness, but they explain behavior associated with consciousness. And that's something very, very different, and we'll come to that when we look at, for example, LLMs, large language models. Right? It's perfectly fine to want to explain behavior associated with consciousness, nothing wrong with it, but that's different from explaining consciousness. Right? If your theory somehow fails to explain this ephemeral, this subjective character, then it's not a theory of consciousness. It may be perfectly decent theory of responses, of planning, of executive function, but it's not a theory of consciousness. And the other challenge studying consciousness is, under many cases, experience can be dissociated from consciousness. Experience can be dissociated from behaviors. So this makes our typical tools that we use in psychology. I flash up a bar and I ask you, is it vertical or horizontal, or I flash a male or female face and you have to tell me which gender, is it looking to the left or right, etc., etc. Now, there are many cases when you have conscious experience, but there isn't any behavior, such as when you dream, right? Every night you dream. Typically, your body is sort of, actively paralyzed by your brainstem neurons, so you don't have behavior. When you're in deep meditation or when you're on a trip, right? When you're truly tripping or on other cases like near-death experience, when the patient's unable to move, but has very powerful experiences that they describe as being among the most meaningful in their life. So again, it's yet another challenge studying it, but we cannot escape this challenge by saying, well, I'm not going to study these cases. If you don't study these cases, again, these are things that we experience, particularly dreaming, every single night, so any theory worth their salt had better explain these cases. All right, so what needs to be explained? Because people typically leave out one very, very big thing that needs to be explained. Okay, so the most obvious one is this one, right? This is the heart of the mind-body problem. If you look at physics, and physics I just take to mean stand for all of sciences. If you look at the foundational equation of physics, general relativity and quantum mechanics, there's nothing there about consciousness. You look at chemistry, you learn all about outer shell electrons, periodic table, covalent bonding. Again, you don't learn anything about consciousness. You look at molecular, genetics, you learn all about nucleotides and proteins and DNA and RNA. You learn nothing about consciousness. Yet here we are, we're conscious creatures. How does that come about? And in fact, David Chalmers has made this very nice argument in his PhD thesis that a world in which we're all zombies, in which none of us has any feelings, but that's exactly identical to the world we live in. But no one loves, no one dreads, no one fears, no one sees, no one, dreams, but everyone moves, everyone acts. Such a world is, of course, not the world we live in, but at least logically and nomologically. In other words, such a world is not at odds with anything in modern science, in modern physics or chemistry or biology, except we don't live in such a world for reasons that we don't know. And so consciousness, and by this reading, is a fact above and beyond at least the laws of science, the laws of physics as currently construed. Now, the other thing that people routinely leave out in their theories of consciousness is the fact that we have to also explain not only why we have any subjective feelings, but the different ways that we have subjective feelings, the different way they feel, right? So space. So one of the most dominant experiences we have is that of space. It could be visual space. It could be auditory space, right? Even with eyes closed, I can hear where people are in space. It could be felt space, my body space. And even if you are in pitch black and there's not a single light, there is already space, and space is very rich with phenomenology. What do I mean by that? Well, if I give you two lights, you can immediately tell, are they close by, are they far away? You can tell, which one is to the left or to the right, which one is above and below. If you have 3D vision, which one is behind, in front, etc. There are neighborhood relationships, there are overlaps, right? There are subsets, there are supersets. So, and all of this extend across in the entire visual field. So this has to be explained. And this feels very different than the passage of time. Right? We're all familiar with the passage of time. Sometimes it flows very slow, like a very slow river, and sometimes it speeds along. We know from when we pay attention, it can be faster. When we're bored, it can be slower. And of psychedelics, it can totally disappear. Right? The time can come to a can freeze. There's only the now, the non-temporal extended now, but it only, of course, flows forward. No one has ever experienced it moving backwards. So that's very different than the phenomenology of space, has to be explained. Colors, there are all sorts of color spaces that psychology have constructed, and there are feelings associated with that, and we have to explain those. Those are very different than feeling angry, or being in love, or being, all of those different conscious states. So a theory has to explain not only why you have experiences, but the particular quality, the particular way this experience feels compared to another one. And the challenge is all these subjective observations have to be accounted for by the objective methods of science. That's the challenge that we are facing. Now, until roughly the Enlightenment, early 17th century, most people, certainly in the West, but almost in all cultures throughout the world, people associate consciousness, the mind, the soul, with the heart, mainly because the heart is the only organ that's palpable, visibly alive, right? If you see people with, due to an injury, you can see the heart is actually pumping. But of course, then in the 17th century, we learned the heart is primarily just a muscle to pump nutrients and oxygen throughout our body. And so since then, we really believe it's this organ, the brain. That's a human brain. Above there is a brain. So we study at the Allen Institute, where we primarily study this and these two brains, 1,000 times smaller, but remarkable similar. In fact, so similar, if I give you a little speck, we've done this at the Institute, if I give you a little speck, a quinoa grain size of mouse or monkey and human brain, nobody except, highly skilled neuroanatomists can tell the difference. It's all the same stuff. We're all nature's children. We have more of it, but of course, blue whales, orcas, etc., have even more of it than we do. Of course, we think we're at the top for unclear reasons. So it's an early picture of me with Francis Crick, with whom I worked for 14 years. He at the down that direction, the Salk Institute. And when I was at Caltech, we got together very, very frequently, almost once a month for 3 days or so. And we're both interested in consciousness. And then we said, well, let's just advocate for an empirical program. Philosophy is interesting. You have to read it and talk to philosophers because they have good questions, although you shouldn't listen to their answers. That's a quote, it's a verbatim quote from Francis. But let's advocate, and this we did in 2000 papers, let's advocate for an empirical program in people, in non-human primates, in other animals like rodents, to discover what's now called the NCC, what we call the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. So you see something like here, German Shepherd, and there must be some mechanisms in the brain that are sort of responsible for that. That if you inactivate them by, let's say, optogenetics or surgery or drugs or TMS, you don't have the experience anymore. And if you trigger them, again, by optogenetics or the electrodes, you can induce the experience. And then you can ask, right? So this is a definition. This actually came from Dave Chalmers. So the sort of the quest is for the search is for the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient for any one conscious experience. And so you can ask, well, where's the experience for German Shepherd? And then is it this, are the NCC the same at night when I dream about this German Shepherd? And how does it relate to the one when I imagine my German Shepherd? And how is it different from the image of a cat? Are there cat neurons and dog neurons? And they're very similar in the same brain area, same cell type. Do they have the same type of connectivity or the same type of electrical activity? So as John mentioned, we had this idea that it's 40 hertz, that 40 hertz is one of the hallmarks of it's an NCC. And so inducing this, the NCC will induce the experience, and eliminating it will eliminate that. Now, this is not a theory. This was never meant to be a theory. It's just an empirical program. Because if we just depend on philosophy, we'll never find the answer. So let's just do good old neuroscience. And it's really very important, which is very difficult to do in the clinic. It's really critical to distinguish this from the background conditions. Well, we know what I mean by that. We know that, for example, your heart has to beat. If your heart doesn't beat, if you get cardiac arrest, within 9 seconds you lose consciousness, right? But nobody would say the heart so the heart is necessary. In fact, it's really the hemoglobin that needs to bring oxygen to the cells in the brain. But so that's an enabling factor. But the heart itself doesn't give rise to consciousness. Same thing, there's, of course, we know there are these 40 different set of three-dimensional, organized in these very complex three-dimensional pattern, used to be called the reticular activating system, extends throughout the brainstem, midbrain, pons, and medulla. A little bit more modern view, this is also 20 years old now. We know that all these sets of neurons in Dow, they project, they have these long-range axonal projections into the forebrain proper, orexin, acetylcholine, et cetera, They do regulation, they do mediate arousal, sleep-wake cycle, all of the stuff that we need. And if you have a small lesion here, it could be pretty bad. If it's bilateral, you're probably in a deep coma and or soon will be dead. But again, these don't provide the content. They're necessary, just like you have to have your power supply on your laptops on, otherwise your laptop isn't going to work. But just like on the laptop, these don't provide the content. We know this because, again, there are patients that may have, where this is intact, but if large parts of cortex are destroyed, they're not conscious. And so, again, these do not provide the content. If you love, if you dread, if you dream, you don't do it with these neurons. You need these neurons in order to do that. But that's not where consciousness happens. So what's the evidence? I'm going to only very briefly summarize this. This is usually part of a longer course I used to teach. So the evidence for the NCC, so now there are hundreds of labs worldwide, they're doing these studies. There are 3 types of evidence that people study in both patients, neurotypical and experimental animals, monkey and or typically now monkey and or mice, transgenic mice, because of the powers of genetics. There's 2 types of causal evidence. That's by far the strongest from an evidentiary point of view. And then there's much more popular but much weaker evidence recording, because this is correlation. And we teach all of our students correlation is not causation. So lesion experiments, and all of these, we all know this as neuroscientists, all of these experiments have challenged this. You can never interpret anything. The brain, as I say, is the most complex piece of highly active matter in the universe. There's all sorts of adaptation mechanisms, and so you have to worry about all of this. This is what keeps, people writing PhD theses about these topics. You got to control for all sorts of things. But still, so the best evidence is lesion and stimulation because they are causal evidence, loss of function or gain of function experiment. So loss of function is you lose a part of the brain, most famously Broca's area, named after the person who first described it in a patient, his patient Tam, in 1858 or something in Paris. You don't have this area anymore, you're unable to speak. And so you can infer something about with all the cautions of adaptation, et cetera, you can infer, well, this area seems to be critically involved in generating speech. Same thing for consciousness. You know, you lose certain parts. You can lose many parts of your front of the brain called non-eloquent cortex, and the patient seems to be perfectly fine. Walks off recovers, surgery, goes home, person is fine, may have some strange behaviors, make constantly jokes, or may have, make inappropriate remark, but is certainly fully conscious. So that tells you can lose many bits of the front of the brain. They don't seem to be directly related to consciousness, for instance. Stimulation, right? Even today, as part of the standard workup during neurosurgery, different types of neurosurgery, the neurosurgeon routinely stimulates. The experience is many parts of the brain you stimulate, at milliamps, 2, 3, 4 milliamps, bipolar electrodes, you don't get anything. The patient doesn't report anything. That part of the brain is non-eloquent, is mute. You stimulate nearby parts of the brain, like motor cortex, and the patient will twitch. You stimulate, visual cortex. You stimulate, Herschel gyrus. You stimulate somatosensory areas. You can get, visual percepts, auditory percepts. You stimulate amygdala. You can get weird feelings. So many parts of the brain you can directly evoke conscious sensation. Many parts, particularly in the front, you can. And then, of course, you can do recording, fMRI, EEG, MEG, PET, single electrode, C-force. You can do all these experiments and see when you do a particular type of experiment, which part of the brain is activated. So the challenge here is always, like anywhere in psychology, you got to dissociate consciousness from all the other stuff that either precedes consciousness or follows from consciousness. So for instance, selective attention. When I tell you, look at the face, because I want to know what's involved in facial conscious awareness, well, you're attending. So am I now looking at the correlates of attention or the correlates of consciousness? And you can dissociate, and people have. Or I put you in a task. You have to push a button when you see a face. Well, it turns out just that task, although it seems very simple, takes up cortical real estate. There's some, parts of the brain that are taken up by remembering I'm in a task, I have to push this button, and of course also by you pushing the button with your left or right hand. So you have to control all of that. All right, so where is this? What's the currently best evidence for where the NCC is? Well, we know it's not in the spinal cord. You can lose your spinal cord, you can be paralyzed to wheelchair. People don't complain. These people do not complain that they suddenly can't hear or can't see anymore or can't love anymore. You can lose your most beautiful neurons, really beautiful neurons, these Purkinje cells, that look like these two-dimensional fans, coral, like this coral structure, very beautiful, highly complicated calcium spikes, very nonlinear. They have a map and a representation of the outside world, so everything what you would expect of a good brain. But if you lose them, and you have particularly they get innervated by these granule cells, right, of which you have 69, 70 billion, a lot. 4 to 5 neurons in your brain are actually in the cerebellum. Yet, if you talk to patients who, due to surgery, have significant parts, very large parts, cubic inches, of their cerebellum removed, they have problems, with ataxia. There's a so-called cerebellar cognitive affective disorder. I talk to some of these patients, and I try to ask them, what has changed before and after the operation in your perception of the world? And, they can talk perfectly well. They can't do things like on a cell phone anymore. They can't play piano anymore. They have those sorts of issues. But none of them tells you, oh, I can't see anymore, I can't hear anymore. And then there are a few individuals, like this Chinese patient, rare, but they are, cerebellar agenesis. They're born without a cerebellum. They never had a cerebellum. They can talk, although, they talk with some difficulty, but they can certainly speak. In this case, she lives an unremarkable life, has a child, but just, does without a cerebellum, certainly fully conscious. So now that tells you that cerebellum isn't involved in generating, whatever else it does, it doesn't seem to be responsible for consciousness, although it has all the accoutrement of a brain and of a neural network. So you have to ask why. And one clue, I think, is that it's, you know, they have this crystalline-like, beautiful, highly regular structure, and it's all feed-forward. It's all feed-forward structure. There's none of that feedback, excitatory loop that you find that's typical in a cortex, where, you know, you put in a single excitation, you get this and reverberation. That's what I think. Anyway, so you have to explain this. Now you come to cortex, right, the outermost layer. In us, we know it's like a pizza, 2 to 3 inch, you know, pizza with toppings. And you got 2 of them, and they're highly convoluted and crammed into your left and right brain, right? And in the mouse, well, in a monkey, it's like this, peanut butter cookie. In a mouse, it's like this, roughly a square centimeter. It's all the same stuff that, you know, 220 million years ago, evolution came up with, very flexible, this 2 plus epsilon dimensional technology, you know, where the largest layer 5 cells, they extend throughout the entire thickness of this cortex. All right, and this is sort of what we're most proud of, you know, the pride of humanity, although we don't have the biggest one. And this comes from a study from, it's a study of 69 patients from the Parvizi lab at Stanford Neurology. So they stimulate, as part of epileptic workup, they stimulate different parts of the brain, and then they just report in these various patients what they experience and where they experience. And again, what's remarkable here, that areas in the back, you can evoke all sorts of sensation, particularly, of course, well, visceral ones, visual ones. In the front, there's very little. You know, so this is direct stimulation. You directly stimulate the brain. Sometimes, of course, you get motor behavior, like if you stimulate motor or premotor. But large parts of the brain, you stimulate, you don't get anything. These are what neurosurgeons refer as non-eloquent cortex. This is another study, also from Stanford, together with Dalzerov, where they look at patients that have specific type of seizures, where they have an aura associated, you know, just before they get the seizure, or the seizure itself. It's a simple seizure, it doesn't generalize, that seem to involve always a sense of self. So there's some of the best evidence for where the sense of self is located. Sort of, you know, this is the anterior cingulate, the posterior cingulate. Here you have posterior medial cortex, the precuneus here. And you can, either by tracking and interviewing these subjects and or by stimulating, by doing stimulation, this is a typical description of a patient. The sense of, you can get these weird dissociations of sense of self, including floating, out-of-body experiences, or when you feel you're listening to your own thoughts in some strange way, you know, located into this area here on the medial sort of walls, posterior medial precuneus, roughly. Of course, similar areas are also reduced in activity in correlation study. This is causation. Correlation study in mindfulness and in psychedelics. Oh, I skipped some slides. All right, so the 2 slides are gone, where I showed older studies from the 30s and 40s, and one more recent study where people had very large lesions due to various tumors. And this was, of course, particularly the case in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, before we had advanced imaging, and patients had to wait much longer before they got to surgery. And what's remarkable, there have been several books written about these. I'm thinking particularly of Brickner's patient here and the patient of Donald Hepp and Penfield. Very long description of patients who, due to tumor, had to remove very large parts, in one case 250, so this is this patient here, with these areas, these are the excised parts of the brain. These are removed, 250 grams left and right, so a large fraction, you know, the brain only weighs 1,300 grams or so. Large parts of prefrontal cortex are removed. The patient goes home. This case was a stockbroker who developed this tumor of the meningitis, went home, didn't do stockbroking anymore, but went home to his farm and lived an unremarkable 10 years of his life. by all account, was perfectly fine. In fact, the EQ test increased after the operation, probably because of the pressure exerted by the tumor on other parts of the brain. And this is not an untypical patient. So there's lots of these patient data where you remove large part of the front of the brain and you don't see an apparent deficit. Now, that's not to say that people don't have deficit, right? If you study these patients carefully, we now know this, there are all sorts of deficits in moral reasoning, in some of the social emotions like empathy, in disinhibition, in planning. Particular Damasio studies these patients. But by and large, what's remarkable, and the neurosurgeon Antonio Damasio themselves remark upon the remarkable unremarkableness of these patients. So you can lose very large parts of your front of your cortex, yet to first order you appear pretty normal. You can speak normally and interact normally with other people. It's just if you observe longer, you have certain oddities. You don't behave quite like you're a regular person with a regular full brain. But at least with respect to consciousness, which what I care about here, there doesn't seem to be too much of a difference. So all the evidence, as far as I'm concerned, from a clinical point of view, particular points to the back of the brain, particularly what we call posterior hot zone, which is an area that includes the higher order visual areas, higher order somatosensory areas, and higher order auditory areas, including the posterior cingulate, for the dominant things that people have investigated in the lab. Doesn't mean that all conscious sensation resides here, but at least the ones that's studied, which is by and large hearing, seeing, touching, sense of self, and agency. Those are the primary. Olfaction, for example, is studied much, much less. And some of the social emotions, they seem to involve more frontal structure, but at least all the basic experiences seem to be, their correlates seem to be in the back. All right. You can also predict recovery much better. People have done these prospective studies where they look at large lesion in patients. This is typically one study is TBI, where you predict recovery 3 months, 6 months, 9 months out, and you really do very well in terms of the conscious awareness when you're focusing on the back of cortex. So it's sort of a region here crudely characterized in this. Now you have to ask, what's different about, if this is true, what's different about this versus this? It's all cortex, right? It's all the same. Well, that's not true. We now know, of course, Jonathan mentioned it, we just finished another series of Allen Brain Atlas, where we dove in yet more people, postmortem people, as well as pieces of human brain we get from surgery. And we now estimate, sort of in the mouse, we know there are 5,000 different cell types, and they differ across cortex. So, you know, even, let's say, in IT, intratelencephalic or an extratelencephalic layer 2-3 cell in V1, at least transcriptional, is not the same as in prefrontal cortex. They're different. They're all different. They may only different by, 10 genes, but that may be very important. So the constitution is not the same everywhere. Although, it's all 5-layered, it's all 6-layered, but of course then there's agranular and dysgranular cortex, that's another different. So there are all sorts of differences in the constitution. So it may be that the constitution of this one precludes you being conscious while this enables consciousness. Or the connectivity, which we think is much likely based on what I'll tell you now. These ones are all topographic areas, and I think that that's the deepest reason. The connectivity here is topographic, multiple grid, multiple spatial resolution. This is more random access. This is where the power of prefrontal cortex comes. You can sort of make very abstract associations. That's more sort of random access or random connectivity, and it has very different effects on what I'll tell you now, but we don't know. All right, and then separately, I'm just throwing in, this one slide I put in because people think when they hear study consciousness, well, that's all very ephemeral and woo-woo, and abstract and all of that. But there are conditions in life that we may all encounter where the rubber of consciousness hits the road of your body. When you're when you had a cardiac arrest, or when you had a massive hemorrhage, or when you had a TBI, et cetera, you're going to the clinic, you're on ventilator support, you may even have open eyes, but you don't respond, right? So people can do the, Glasgow coma scale or the coma scale revised, and you grade on the lower edge, 3 or 4. In other words, I ask you, sir, can you hear me? Can you move your eyes? Can you move your fingers? Can you say anything? And you can't. And this is now day 3. And this is now day 4. And this is now day 5. And what happens in this country, after day 3, 4, 5, the doctors start a discussion with the loved one, with the family, about withdrawal of life critical support. 80% of these patients, this is published numbers, 80% of these patients, of DOC patient, disorder of consciousness patient, die because of withdrawal of life critical support, where the family together with the medical caretaker decide for whatever reason this is not what they would have wanted. But we know 20% of these patients are covertly conscious. They are unable to signal, but they're conscious. So it's a large number of patients, and so we need a tool, a technology that can test whether these patients are conscious. And this integrated information theory that I'm telling you about now has sort of developed a code technique. Essentially, you ring the brain, you knock the brain by pulsing a magnetic pulse, and then you recover the EEG signature, the response of that. So it's like listening to a bell. You hit the bell, you listen to its echoes, and you compute the complexity of it. And there's this threshold where if the complexity is high, you're conscious. You may be unable to move because you're experiencing a dream, or you may be under ketamine where you're dissociated, but you're fully conscious. If it's below the threshold, the patient isn't conscious, either because they're deeply asleep or because they're truly not conscious, or because they're anesthetized. All right. Now, what are the limitations of this NCC? So the NCC is a purely empirical project, just like finding a detector for consciousness. This is a purely empirical project that sooner or later will come to a conclusion. Sooner or later we'll know these neurons with this cell type, with those genes in that part of the brain doing this thing, that's what you need for consciousness, all right? But right now we're not there. So I made this bet, this infamous bet with David Chalmers, the philosopher, 26 years ago, where I was much younger and I was rash, and I said, okay, Dave, in 25 years we'll knock this out of the park. The park will know what the neural correlates is, and the community will agree. That's not the case, and so last year I conceded. But this is just, and he agrees, this is just a temporary thing. Right now we haven't converged, but there's no question we will converge on this. But ultimately, we don't just want correlates. That's nice, but we want more. Even if these are causal. So these correlates are important because then we can say, well, when does a fetus first have these correlates? And what about these patients with disorders of consciousness? And what about cats and mice? Do they have this correlates? But then we get to bees. They don't have anything like a cortex. So how can we infer from a bee? Or what about other things like any other thing any other organism on tree alive? To what extent are they conscious? Does it feel like something to be a protozoa? Does it feel like something to be a giant sequoia tree? This doesn't tell us because the human brain is too far away from that. We want to understand how it arises, how the experience feels like, and particularly these days, of course, we want to be able to extrapolate our theories to systems that are very different from us, such as cerebral organoids, like Ken Koch and others here are studying, or most importantly, the things now we encounter in our daily life, large language models, right, that are, we're at a singular moment in history where there's new intelligence that's now on the planet. We have to deal with it, whether we like it or not. And one of the questions people ask, is it conscious? Now, so far, Google and OpenAI, they're all very careful to put guardrails on this, right? Because if you ask them, they all claim, oh, no, we're not conscious. We're not conscious, because they don't want to scare us. But we simply don't know, unless you have a theory. You can sort of, you can have gut feelings, are they conscious or not? But we simply don't know, because we don't have a general theory that allows us to infer consciousness from the only people where we sure, the only things where we sure have it, namely us, to things that are very different from us. All right, and now I'm just going to highlight there are two sort of very different camps, two sort of theories that people have constructed. The dominant one that very much fit within the spirit of our times, which is information and information processing, is really functionalism. Now this goes back at least to Putnam the philosopher Putnam, if not earlier. So functionalism is a thesis that every mental state is really, what's important about that particular mental state, like being in love or short-term memory, is that it has a functional role. And functionalism ultimately, what it is, it's a causal relationship of this state to all other sensory states, to all other mental states, to sensory input and sensory output. So I had this long correspondence with Dan Dennett, probably the best known American analytic philosopher, who of course denies that there's truly something like consciousness. Although at other moments he says, well, I don't quite say that, but he comes effectively to denying it. So for him, there is nothing like qualia. In fact, he said that explicitly, qualia humbug. What there is people, if they have toothache, they rub their chin, they talk about their pain, they avoid moving, they avoid chewing on that side of the mouth. So it's all these behavioral and disposition. That has to be explained. But the feeling itself, that's all, that doesn't really exist. We're just terribly confused about it, which strikes me as truly incoherent to me personally. I mean, if you've ever had pain, just to say, well, sorry, you don't really are in pain, you're just confused about it, just strikes me literally as incoherent. I hear him, but I don't know how to parse that. And this is dominant, so most analytic philosophers that used to be dominant, although they're now, I think, they're now sunsetting somewhat. This is the dominant philosophy that consciousness either doesn't exist or it's illusion or needs to be eliminated. There are different schools of this. There's eliminative functionalism, there's illusionism, there are all these variants. And of course in big tech, it's very dominant. And so these theories are like this. So global neural works with very explicitly recurrent processing theory, higher order thought theory, attentional schema, etc. That are reasonably well-developed theories. They ultimately all argue that consciousness has a particular function. For example, global neuronal workspace, the function is to broadcast information very widely from the front of the brain to the back. And once you've instantiated that operation in a universal Turing machine, then of course this Turing machine would be conscious. I mean, what else is there? It's just computation. So that's the underlying metaphysics here, that everything has a function, that if you can instantiate the function on a Turing machine, then this Turing machine can now be said to have all the attributes of that function, in this case, including consciousness. So by that measure, okay, we can skip this. This is one of the challenges. You have to say, well, if it's broadcasting, what is it magical? Why if I broadcast like this, or I broadcast something, is it true of any broadcasting? Is it also true of broadcasting information in the retina? Or when my liver sends out enzyme and they go throughout the liver, does that also count as broadcasting? Or if it's 40 hertz, you have to explain, well, what's special about 40 hertz? Why not 42? Seems a nicer number. Or why not 50 or 30? I mean, it seems rather random that only 40 hertz seems to give rise to consciousness. So you have to explain that. And of course, this is what Chalmers called the hard problem. But at least now it's very explicit. So now people sort of make their metaphysical commitment, because until last year, there was a sort of attempt to cancel integrated information theory because it has a very different metaphysical stance. It's very explicit about it, metaphysics. In response to which, I think one of the good things that has come from that attempt to cancel is that people are now more explicit with their metaphysics, because often I still meet scientists, they say, no, I don't have metaphysical assumption. Those people have metaphysics. I'm just a scientist. I just go where the science takes me, right? Where the facts takes me. But of course we realize there are no facts lying around. You have to assume what counts as a fact and what doesn't count as a fact, right? We learned that very, very explicitly during the COVID crisis, COVID-19, what counts as a fact and what doesn't count as a fact. So here now it's very explicit that people say it's computation. The computation are necessary and sufficient. So in other words, if you had the right clever algorithm running on this laptop will feel like something. That's the idea. All right? Now, contra that, there is this, and so then it's just a question of, well, what is the right software? What do you need? You still need this loop or that loop. You still need some more working memory or some more planning ability. And so now their debates is, is GPT 3.5, maybe not 3.5, but maybe 4. If not 4, it's GPT 5, So then it's only a question, it'll be very soon, within a year or two, that there will be truly conscious machine if this is valid. Now, IT itself, constructed by this Italian-American psychiatrist and neuroscientist at University of Madison in Wisconsin, is very, very different. It's just a fundamentally different animal, for better or worse. It's very mathematical. It's very formal. It starts with axiom and defines what exists. So that's why a lot of physicists like it, and a lot of people dislike it, because it starts with consciousness. It starts with René Descartes. It says centrally what exists is not an external world first. What exists is consciousness, and consciousness has properties. Any conscious experience is intrinsic. It's only for the thing itself. Doesn't depend on other things. It just is intrinsic to that particular experience. It is very specific. The experience of pain, of tooth pain, is very different of the experience of someone stepping on my toe. It's very different from untold other conscious experience I could be having. It's structured. Every conscious experience is structured like my conscious experience of this. It is left, it is right, it is up, it's down, it has neighborhood relationships, etc. It's definite. That means there are certain things that are in this conscious experience and many, many things that are outside. And it's integrated. It's only one. Any experience is integrated. Even if I think, even if I'm driving down the road, I'm listening to NPR while the information streams through my eyes. I don't see too much because I'm focused on the voice on the radio speaker. But that combination, that is a single integrated experience. And then essentially, it defines this in the language of the mathematical language of causal relation, because it defines what exists as what is causal power. This goes back to a line in Plato, the Sophist, when a character says that also known as Alexander dictum, what exists is what causes, and things exist the more they cause. And so by causal power, here it's something very operational. You can define it and you can compute it explicitly, is to make a difference and to take a difference. Anything that can make a difference and take a difference exists. So in physics, some of you may know there was this concept in the 19th century, early 20th century, called the ether, which was supposedly this substance that pervades all of space. And finally, physicists doing various well-known experiments concluded, well, if this ether exists, it has such properties we can't test it. It doesn't seem to do anything. And there's nothing that we can do that would show an effect on it. So it cannot make a difference and can't take a difference. And then we simply got rid of it. There's no more ether in modern physics. And so this notion says what exists. For any system, if I have a system, a mathematical description of a system, whether those be transistors or neurons, you can write down the causal power of the system, which really says, given those three, what's the causal power of these three neurons? Well, what's the probability if I turn these three neurons off that those two neurons over there will go on? If they're totally independent, then these three neurons have no causal effect on those. Or I can take those 5 neurons here and turn them off, and I can study the effect on the rest of the circuit. I have to do it for all possible combinations. So you can see this goes very quickly, goes with the power of 2 to the 2 to the n, all the different relations and distinctions. And that's ultimately what causal power is. And consciousness is causal power upon itself. That's the difference between causal power on others, like gravity exerts a causal power, a black hole will exert causal power on others, but it has minimal causal power upon itself. The brain, being a very, very complex system, has a lot of causal power on itself. In other words, it can be a source of change, because depending the state the system is, it will directly determine the next state, and the next state, and the next state that it is, and that's causal power. And you can compute this. If you have a transition probability matrix, you can explicitly compute all these quantities. So it's not anything ethereal woo-woo. It's inherent in the physics of the system. It's very important. It's inherent in the physics of the system, be that transistors, a set of transistors. It's totally agnostic with respect to the underlying hardware. And so it starts with consciousness, says consciousness exists and has these 5 properties. It's intrinsic, it's specific, it's definite, it's structures, and it's unique. And then looks around. So given every experience has to have these 5 properties, and I can define these properties in terms of causal power. Now I'm looking for physical mechanism. Which physical mechanisms suffice this mathematical calculus, like brains? And I now look for specific circuits inside the brain, and these 5 axioms, here I have them. So each experience is intrinsic, specific, unitary, definite, and structure. And this translates to this mathematical calculus. Some of you may have heard it gives rise to a number called phi. Phi is a pure number between 0 and infinite. Phi is sort of, you can think of the complexity or the irreducibility of the system. And if the system has 0 phi, it strictly doesn't exist as a system. It's actually you can sort of treat it as as distinct subcomponents. It's not a single integrated system. The bigger the phi, the more integrated the system, the more irreducible, the more it is conscious. In some very technical sense, the more it is conscious. Now the quality, what it feels like, arises out of all these causal relations that you need to analyze and unfold. So you look at all the possible subsets of all these neurons, all these elements switching and influencing other, being in a particular state. This is always specific to the state. You unfold all of that, and you get this this high-dimensional form in a very high-dimensional space. And now IIT makes this very radical step. It says this form, this structure, maps one-to-one. It's not the same as, it's not identity relationship, but it maps one-to-one onto every facet of your particular experience. So let's see, this brain, the posterior heart zone, it has a particular experience. Let's see what I see now. Okay? And the claim is that if I look at right now, given the state of my neurons that are right now in, I can unfold this structure, and every facet of this structure maps one-to-one onto my current experience. That's what the experience is. It doesn't follow from, you don't need anything additional. It's an identity relation, so there's nothing left over on this side or on the other side. All right, now it makes a number of very counterintuitive predictions. So phi is a quantity, and the quality is described by this form, this crystal in this very high-dimensional space. That's what we experience as consciousness. And in principle, any system that has this complexity different from phi, there's no threshold. It doesn't say phi has to be at least 42. It's any system, any complexity different from phi will feel like something. Now, how much surely there are going to be systems that have small phi, and there are systems that have very large phi, and scales very dramatically with 2 to the n, because you have to look at all possible relationships. So, for instance, it makes this prediction, which people are trying to test, totally counterintuitive. So, okay, this is during wakefulness. You have all these causal relationships. Now you look at the posterior heart zone under 2 conditions. In one case, this has been done experimentally. You get long-term meditators, 20 long-term Buddhist meditators, and you get them in a state of what's known as pure presence. And you put a high density, while they do high density EEG, and when they get in this pure presence, it's defined as sort of thoughtless, no percepts, no thought, no self anymore, but they're still conscious. You can see, compared to various other controls, there's a lull in activity. There's very little delta, so these meditators aren't asleep, but there's also very little gamma, because there's supposedly because there's very little content. So now let's take let's just, for the sake of argument, just to make this thought experiment a little bit clearer, assume these neurons aren't firing, but the patient is, the meditator is highly conscious. In this case, I poison, I paralyze, I anesthetize the posterior heart zone, let's say by injecting locally lidocaine. In both cases, it's the same brain. In both cases, the posterior heart zone doesn't fire, in this case and in this case. Now, conventional information processing, and of course we all think constantly about information because we all imbue it, we carry information around. Remember Shannon, right? Shannon tells us which code to use when you want to transmit a message from a sender to a receiver. And so most people look at this and say, well, what is this thing sending? It doesn't send out information, so it surely can't be any meaningful. There's no message being sent. That's certainly what global neuronal workspace would say. But what's so pernicious about this information paradigm, there is no sender and receiver in the brain because there isn't a homunculus. It's not like this area needs to convey information over here. Whatever meaning arises has to arise from the brain. And as we all know, the brain is dark and gooey inside, and so the brain doesn't, it doesn't make sense to send information within the brain. It's meaningful for us as external neuroscientists, so I can identify, and I did in my youth, you can identify Jennifer Aniston neuron, but you have to ask, how does a Jennifer Aniston neuron acquire meaning? Not for me, because I can see there's a relationship between picture of Jennifer Aniston and the firing of the neuron, but I have to see how does it arrive within the brain itself. All right, so the IIT would say in this case, so in both cases, physically it looks very similar. Neurons aren't firing, neurons aren't firing. IIT says this is a highly conscious state, in this case of pure presence. IIT says here, nothing. This patient isn't conscious. Where's the difference? Causal structure. Here you've just turned off the causal structure. You've anesthetized. You inject lidocaine, so that prevents the sodium channel from firing. So this, you've dramatically reduced the causal power of this network. Well, here the neurons could fire, but don't fire. It's a little bit, for those of you who are familiar with Sherlock Holmes, it's a little bit like Silver Blaze, the story of the dog that didn't bark. The dog didn't bark, and Sherlock Holmes points to the clueless Inspector Lestrade, says that's the important clue. Why is that important? Well, the dog didn't bark. It could have barked, but it didn't bark because it knew the perpetrator, right? And that's the difference. If the dog would have been poisoned, then it would be uninformative. But the dog was in this state. He could have barked, but didn't bark. Okay, so this is one of many very counterintuitive prediction that IIT is trying to test. Okay, let me come to the end here. This is about selflessness. So the other big thing, this is my last slide, I want to emphasize, because IIT makes a very big distinction between intelligence and consciousness. And I now routinely go on these panels where we talk about machine intelligence, and then there's always a question, well, when are machines going to be conscious? So first of all, we have to remember that intelligence is about behavior, ultimately, right? It's making inferences to ultimately behave, to do something, to invest money for the short term or the long term, or to plan for some events in the short term, in the medium term, and the long term, etc., which is very different from consciousness. Consciousness ultimately is a state of being. You're in a state of being where you're happy, or you're anxious, or you see something, or you hear something. And so according to IIT, you can certainly dissociate them, and you can have sort of a scale. This would be the phi scale, from 0 when you're not conscious to very large number. And here you can have a generalized intelligence quotient that we don't really have. We can measure IQ in people, and people have tried to attempt to define IQ in mice and other animals, but there isn't anything generalized. But just bear with me. We all agree a medusa probably has low intelligence, a bee has more, a mouse has more, Bernie's mountain dog has a lot. And then, we come to humans. So here, historically, until a few years ago, there's always this monotonic relationship between intelligence and consciousness. When you get people, or animals, they are somehow, depending on the exact evolution, and you can play around a lot with this using artificial simulated evolution, you get this sort of increasing relation between people, organisms that are more intelligent, they can do planning for more contingency over a longer time scale versus being more or less conscious. But now, of course, we find ourselves in a world where we had, Deep Blue a long time ago, AlphaGo, it's only 10 years ago, and now, OpenAI. And the scary thing, there's no upper bound on this axis. There's no natural bound for intelligence. One way to think about superintelligence is just human intelligence, but let's say 1,000 times faster, right? That's, I think, a good way of thinking about it. If something can think the way we can, or at least the way the best humans can, like think about Albert Einstein, but can do it 1,000 times faster than they're effectively super intelligent. So they would be somewhere there on this axis. But according to IIT, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, digital computers, the way digital computers are built with one transistor talking to 2 or 3 other transistors, this doesn't apply to neuromorphic computer, it doesn't apply to quantum computers, but digital computers in the cloud, like right now they're used for cloud computing for, you know, ChatGPT and Bing and all the other ones, they're not going to be conscious, but they could be very, very intelligent. And likewise, on the other hand, this other engineered product may be quite, you know, if you think in a few years we can do tissue, vascularization, and we can build not just these little organoids we can design today, but big organoids like, you know, a pizza. What happens, you know, if you go to a lab and you see all these pizzas that are being assembled, that are being grown from human-induced pluripotent stem cells, right? And they have crisscrossing waves and, you know, activity, just like, you know, high gamma activity and 1/f and all of that. Well, then they may well be conscious. It may well feel like something, but we can all agree they probably have very little intelligence, partly because, you know, we haven't given them input or output. And so it's really important in this looming, as we go over the next years, and it's going to happen very quickly in, you know, the development of more and more intelligent, non-human, non-biological organisms, to not confuse consciousness, to not, you know, confuse consciousness with intelligent. All right. So I claim to study consciousness, you have to start with consciousness. You cannot go from the outside in. You can't start with brains or with function and then try to infer. Then you get to the hard problem. You have to start with consciousness and go outward to the world, from consciousness to the world. Consciousness, according to IIT, is not a process. It's not a message. It's not an activity pattern. It's not a computation. It's not an algorithm. It's a structure. It's a form. Its substrate in humans is the posterior region of cortex. Okay, I didn't talk about that. And digital computers, as currently conceived, will not be conscious. Fundamentally, consciousness is about being, while intelligence is about doing. And with that, I thank you for your attention.